السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. من يهدي الله فهو المهتد ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله وحبيبه، بلغ الرسالة وأدى الأمانة ونصح الأمة، فكشف الله به الغمة، وتركنا على المحجة البيضاء ليلها كنهارها لا يزيغ عنها إلا هالك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. O you who believe, fear and be conscious of Allah as He should be feared, and do not die except in a state of total submission to Him and Him only. Amma ba'd. Brothers and sisters in Islam, this past month we've learned and heard about many stories of the Sahaba. And every time a hadith of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is mentioned, two very famous names follow after. Two narrators follow after. Either Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As or the most famous Abu Hurairah, the one and only. And the only difference between Abdullah and Abu Hurairah was that Abdullah, he could read and write, and Abu Hurairah couldn't. And so Abdullah, he knew a lot, because every time he used to hear the Prophet say something, he would go and he would jot it down. He would write it down immediately. But when it came to Abu Hurairah, his memory was top notch. His memory was so powerful to the point where he was called Hafidhul Islam, which literally translates to a person who has memorized the entirety of Islam. He was also called Sayyidul Huffaz, the master of everyone who memorized, the master of those who had a powerful memory. And there is a reason why, which we will get to later in the khutbah, inshallah. So to start off, Abu Hurairah, he was born into the tribe of Banu Dos. And his father, Sakhr, he named him Abdi Shams, which literally translates to the slave of the sun. The slave of the sun. And he accepted Islam at a young age through a man by the name of At-Tufayl ibn Amr, who was in charge of the tribe. And so At-Tufayl, what he did was he was visiting Mecca, and he had listened to the Prophet, and he had accepted Islam on the spot. And when he came back to his people, he spread Islam to his people, and Abu Hurairah accepted at a very young age. And later down the line, during the 7th year of Hijrah, Abu Hurairah gave up all of his belongings, and he made Hijrah to Medina with his mother. And his mother wasn't yet Muslim. And so upon meeting the Prophet ﷺ, he asked him, "What's your name?" He said, "My name is Abdi Shams." The Prophet looked at him, he said, No, you're not Abdi Shams. Bal anta Abdul Rahman. He said, "You're not the slave of the sun. You're the slave of the most merciful." And so he was named Abdul Rahman ibn Sakhr. And while in Medina, he took care of his mother. And every time he would learn something from the Prophet, he would go back and he would invite his mother towards Islam. But his mother didn't agree with Prophet Muhammad at all. And one day it got really bad to the point where she said some bad words about the Prophet. And that made Abu Hurairah very, very sad. And so he went to the Prophet complaining. And he was crying. He said, "Ya Rasulullah, I keep inviting my mother towards Islam, but she keeps rejecting. Ya Rasulullah, please make dua for my mother. Please make dua for Allah to guide my mother." And so the Prophet did. And immediately when he went back to see his mother, to his surprise, his mother took the Shahada on the spot. And his mother became Muslim. And so Abu Hurairah, he wanted to learn more about Islam. And he wanted to learn from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he would spend a lot of time with him. And if we were to look back at the state of Medina at that time, there were 3 groups. There were the Muhajirin, there were the Ansar, and then there were, people like Abu Hurairah. So the Muhajirin, they traveled from Mecca to Medina. And they established businesses and work, and they got it going for themselves in Medina. And the Ansar, they were already in Medina. So everything they had were just normal to them. They had their work going on, their farming going on. But then the third group, the likes of Abu Hurairah, they weren't trading and they weren't farming. They weren't from Al-Ansar and they weren't from Muhajirin. And so they were called Ahl al-Siffa. And Ahl al-Siffa, they used to live in the back of the masjid. And they were extremely poor people who were deprived of worldly belongings. And they sacrificed everything for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and for the sake of the Messenger. And they were devoted to learn from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they were with the Prophet every single day, 7 days a week. And one day, Abu Hurairah, he came to the Prophet. And he said, "Ya Rasulullah," he was narrating, he said, "قال قلت يا رسول الله إني أسمع منك حديثا كثيرا أنساه." He said, "Ya Rasulullah, I listen to you and I hear a lot of narrations, a hadith from you. But ya Rasulullah, I forget them. It's a weakness that he knows." He says, "I forget them." So then the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Spread your rida, ya Abu Hurairah." He said, "Spread your garment, Abu Hurairah." And Abu Hurairah, he spread his garment on the floor. And Abu Hurairah, he says, "I did accordingly." And then the Prophet moved his hands as if he was filling them up with something. And then he would empty them on my rida, on my garment. And then he said, after the Prophet was done, the Prophet told him, he said, "Take your garment and wrap it all over your body. Wrap it above your head for it to cover all your body." And he did. And he said, "Wallahi, from that moment on, I never forgot anything that the Prophet said. I never forgot anything that the Prophet said." And in another incident, Abu Hurairah was in the masjid. He was doing some dhikr with some Sahaba, such as Zayd ibn Thabit and whatnot. As the Prophet, he came in, he saw them. The Sahaba, one by one, they started making dua, and the Prophet started saying Ameen to all of their du'as. And we know that when the Prophet makes a dua, it gets answered. So they took turns. They were excited. They were happy. Yes, our du'as are, the Prophet is going to make dua for us. He's going to say Ameen to our du'as. Yes, like it's going to happen. And so every Sahaba started saying their dua, and the Prophet repeated, he said Ameen until it came time for Abu Hurairah. And the dua that Abu Hurairah, he asked Allah, he said, Ya Allah, I ask you for knowledge which will not be forgotten. I ask you for knowledge which will never be forgotten. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said Ameen. And so Abu Hurairah was given this knowledge. He was given knowledge that shouldn't and won't and would never be forgotten. And that is how Abu Hurairah came to be. That is how Abu Hurairah came to be. He lived and he narrated over around 6,000 ahadith. 6,000 ahadith, give or take. And the time he spent with the Prophet was only 4 years of his life. Yet he accomplished so much. He was able to gather so many ahadith that were, that stayed for on and on, that we still benefit from till this day. And in the second part of the khutbah, inshallah, we'll discuss some lessons that we can take from the story of Abu Hurairah. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فيقول مستغفرين استغفروا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا محمد عليه أفضل السلام وأتم التسليم أما بعد. So from the amazing story of Abu Hurairah, I wanted to focus on 2 points that we can all take home today. The first point being how eager Abu Hurairah was to seek knowledge. How eager he was to learn from the Prophet. How eager he was to memorize what he's learning and to apply it as well. And the people who seek out knowledge, they have a special status in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anyone who seeks out knowledge, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, يَرْفَعِ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ دَرَجَاتٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, Allah will raise in rank those of you who have faith and those who have been given knowledge. The question is, how do I attain knowledge? How can I be given knowledge, right? The Prophet ﷺ, he says, indeed, knowledge only comes by learning. Indeed, knowledge only comes by learning. So we have to do our part. We have to read about the Prophet. We have to read ahadith. We have to read Quran. We have to obtain that knowledge. We have to make an effort. And the rest is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But as long as we're not taking this first step, we won't go anywhere. We won't go anywhere as long as we're standing in our place. We have to take a step forward. And we have to ask ourselves, how can I learn? And where can I learn? And who can I learn from? And what do I want to learn? We need to sit with ourselves, make an evaluation list, and answer all of these questions and execute a plan accordingly. Because whoever seeks out knowledge has a special place in Islam. And the second and final point that I wanted to focus on is the willingness of Abu Hurairah, the willingness of him sacrificing everything for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet. And that was the mentality of the Sahaba back then. That's why they were up there. And that's why the Sahaba had, the utmost honor. It's because of their willingness to sacrifice anything and everything for the sake of Allah and His Messenger. Abu Hurairah, he gave up everything in his tribe just to go to Medina and to learn from the Prophet. He sacrificed everything to live in the back of a masjid and to not have food for a lot of days and to not have proper clothing for a good amount of time. and to worry about where his next meal is going to be from. He sacrificed all of that for the sake of Allah and for the sake of the Prophet. And if we were to look at this from an outward appearance, he would be at a total loss, right? But wallahi, it's the complete opposite. It's the complete opposite. He lost his dunya, but he got rewarded with his akhirah. Ibn Ata'illah, he says, متى فتح لك باب الفهم في المنع عاد المنع عين العطاء. When he opens up your understanding of deprivation, deprivation becomes the same as giving. And Abu Hurairah was deprived of all worldly pleasures, but he fully understood that that specific deprivation became the same as giving. Why? Because although he was stripped of all materialistic objects in his life, he was given something far greater than it. Knowledge which will never be forgotten. His name is mentioned till this day, narrating the hadith of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is the mentality that we should go into the New Year's, brothers and sisters. This is the mentality of the Sahaba that they had. This upcoming year, Allah might take from me. And we should be ready to accept that in our hearts and in our minds. And we should understand that when Allah takes, it's good. It's better for me. And when He takes, it's better for me. And whenever He takes, He might be giving instead. And we have to open our minds to this and fully comprehend this. And only then we can, rise up in ranks. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us knowledge, beneficial knowledge, and knowledge that we can teach our kids and our grandchildren and all of generations to come. Allahumma ighfir lana warhamna wa'afina wa'fu anna. اللهم تجاوز عن سيئاتنا. اللهم إنا نسألك رضاك والجنة ونعوذ بك من عذاب القبر وعذاب النار. اللهم إننا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. اللهم لا تجعلنا من الخاسرين ولا تجعلنا من المتكبرين ولا تجعلنا يا ربي من المنافقين واجعلنا يا ربي من المحسنين ومن المتقين ومن الصالحين ومن عبادك ومن أوليائك المقربين إليك. وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وأقم الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
لا إله إلا الله دائما لا إله إلا الله.